If you're new here, I'm Hilly and I am a historian who specializes in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is one of the most powerful and enduring empires, lasting around 600 years. The Ottomans ruled a vast area stretching from Africa to Europe and Asia, but Ottoman history remains clouded by myths and stereotypes. So in today's video, we're going to take a deeper look into 10 of the most common myths that I come across. I've tried to limit them down because there's so many of them. These are questions that I get a lot, and I also see them in a lot of my research. So let's just get straight into it. Myth number one of the most famous stories about the founding of the Ottoman Empire is that Osman, who was a nomadic warrior and the founder of the empire, had a dream one night. It was said that in this dream, a large tree was kind of growing out of Osman's chest, and it spread its shade across the whole world, symbolizing the future empire's global reach. Although it's a very compelling story, it's not true. The story is encountered in Ashok Pashazade's history. Ashok Pashazade was a historian and courtier during the reign of Mehmed II. This is over a century after Osman's reign. So historians agree that this is not a true account, but instead is a dynastic myth, a symbolic tale that was concocted to legitimize Ottoman rule in a time when there were a lot of principalities and Islamic dynasties that were directly challenging the Ottomans. You may be wondering, how does this dream do this? This dream occurred while Osman was staying in the house of a sheikh. So a sheikh is like a very important religious figure, and that when Osman had this dream, he explained it to the sheikh, and the sheikh interpreted it in this way. During the medieval era, dreams were believed to have some kind of spiritual and kind of symbolic significance. It was very common to have your dream interpreted by religious figures. If a sheikh was telling Osman that he's going to become, a world ruler and his dynasty will rule for all of eternity, then that gave it some legitimacy. Myth number two, the Ottomans were purely religious warriors or ghazis. So it's often believed that the Ottomans were early ghazis. These were devout holy warriors who would basically go on raids into non-Muslim territories, take back booty and slaves, and also conquer territories, which meant that the Islamic land and empire would grow. The idea that the Ottomans were very successful because of their adherence to Gaza or Holy War was a thesis that was put forward by Paul Wittig. He is a very important historian who in the early 20th century tried to understand why the Ottomans were so successful in comparison to the scores of different Turkish principalities that also popped up at the time. However, more recent scholarship such as Jemal Kafazad or Heath Lowry have challenged this oversimplification. While religion was certainly a very important part of Ottoman identity and their success amongst the Turkmen tribes, the early Ottomans were also motivated by tribal struggles and the need to look after the tribe. This was the main role of a tribal leader, of a bey, who was the chieftain, especially so within the Turkic tribal system, which basically, if you did not look after your tribe, you could get knocked off the leaderboard by a much stronger, more charismatic leader. Pragmatic alliances were also really important in growing the Ottoman Empire. For instance, Orhan Gazi, the second ruler and the son of Osman Gazi, had allied with a Christian ruler, his name was Kantakouzenos, during the Byzantine Civil War. Far from being just a purely ideological struggle, early Ottoman expansion was complex and strategic. Myth number three, the Ottoman Empire was oppressive towards non-Muslim people. There is a very common belief that non-Muslims were oppressed under Ottoman rule. While non-Muslims were definitely second-class citizens, they were called dhimmis or zimmi, and they had to pay special taxes called the jizya. The reality was much more nuanced. The Ottomans developed the millet system, which allowed religious communities to govern themselves in matters of law, education, and worship. For example, the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople held a semi-official position, acting as a liaison between the empire and and the Orthodox community. Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492 by Isabella and Ferdinand were welcomed into the empire by Sultan Bayezid II, who recognized their economic and cultural value. While political, social and economic inequalities certainly existed, and while there were brutal suppression of independence movements in the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman tolerance of non-Muslims was much greater than European tolerance of non-Christians. Myth number 4, the Janissaries were always corrupt and barbaric. So the Janissaries, who were an elite corps of soldiers who in the early stages of the empire were made up of devshirme, so enslaved boys and men, and who in the later portion after the 17th and 18th centuries were taken from the Anatolian population, are often portrayed as a brutal, corrupt and politically dangerous force. While this was true in later centuries, especially from the 17th century onwards when they had become hereditary and almost resistant to reform, their early history tells us a different story. They were very instrumental in the Ottoman victories at Varna in 1444 or Kosovo, and in the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Their decline came when they became very politicized and began to partake in palace politics and coups, which led to their violent dissolution by Sultan Mahmud II in 1826, an event that was called the Auspicious Incident because it was considered such a blessing to the empire, and perhaps it was. Myth number 5. The Ottoman Empire declined steadily after the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent. Modern historians like Caroline Finkel argue that the empire went through periods of transformation, adaptation and revival rather than just a linear, steady decline. For instance, in the 17th century, the emergence of the Köprülü viziers led to military and administrative reforms. In the 18th century and the 19th centuries, the Tanzimat reforms modernized the army, education and legal system. The Ottoman state was still a significant power well into the 1800s, engaging in diplomacy, warfare and modernization. Myth 6, and this is one I particularly like. Sultans ruled with absolute unchecked power. Yes, the Ottoman Sultan was at the top of the political and religious hierarchy, but his power was constrained by institutions, advisors and the ulema, who were Islamic scholars. The Imperial Council, or the Divan, was led by the Grand Vizier. This man played a key role in governance, which often led to sultans like Selim III and Abdulhamid II having to navigate factions at court, religious resistance, or pressure from the Janissaries. Legal scholars, or the ulema, also had significant influence over law making and religious laws. There were two main systems of law. There was the secular Kanun and there was the religious Sharia. Different millets like Jews and Christians were able to apply their own religious law as well. Also, there was often a lot of factionalism at court. There was the influence of the valide, the mother, or of the haseki, who was the chief consort of the sultan, and so governance was more of a negotiated process than a dictatorship. Myth 7. Devshirme was intended to mass convert people to Islam. The Devshirme system was a system of mass slavery, we could call it, where Christian boys from the Balkans were taken as a form of taxation and they were recruited to serve the Ottoman state. They could be taken with or without their family's consent. However, the issue was not to convert people to Islam. The Devshirme were the main way that the Ottomans sourced their army and their statesmen. The boys were taken at very young ages. They were given an elite education, military and bureaucratic training, and many rose to high positions of power. After the 1500s, most of the viziers, such as Sokulu Mehmet Pasha, were of Devshirme background. These boys who were raised in the Devshirme system were often married to girls who were also enslaved. They were all brought up at court, and the point of this was to create a very loyal class of people who simply served the empire without being constrained by Turkic tribal practices. The Ottomans mainly did this because in the traditional Turkish nomadic tribal system. Family is very important, tribal ties are very important. To curtail all of those influences on their state and on their power, they preferred to create a new class of governing and military personnel from scratch, basically. So while it was very coercive, it was very violent at times, it was one of the main reasons why the Ottoman Empire lasted so long. Myth number 8. The Ottomans refused to modernize. There is a misconception that the Ottomans refused to modernize and only did so when it became too late. In fact, the Ottoman Empire made several attempts at modernization, many in the 17th and 18th centuries. Ottoman philosophers and statesmen were quite aware of the decline of the empire and that they needed to modernize and that they were behind in comparison to Europe. But many of these reforms were stifled by the Janissaries, who wanted to hold on to their power. Only after the dissolution of the Janissaries in the 1820s were the Tanzimat reforms successfully adopted. The Tanzimat reforms introduced new legal codes, a secular education system, and modern postal and telegraph networks. The army was restructured along European lines, with foreign advisors like von Moltke the Elder aiding reform. Urban infrastructure, including railways, schools, and hospitals, expanded in major cities like Istanbul, Izmir, and Damascus. So the problem really wasn't a lack of desire to modernize, it was that the infrastructure wasn't there, it was that there were very powerful groups like the Janissaries who were stopping it, and the empire was so vast that it could not be implemented evenly. Myth number 9. The Ottoman Empire was culturally and scientifically backwards. The Ottomans are often overlooked in discussions about global cultural and scientific development, but they made significant contributions to art, architecture, and science. Mimar Sinan, who was the chief imperial architect under Suleiman, designed iconic mosques like Süleymaniye and Selimiye, blending Byzantine and Islamic styles to create a new Ottoman architectural style. Ottoman scholars such as Taqi al-Din built observatories in the 16th century that rivaled those in Europe. Ottoman manuscript culture also flourished, producing richly illustrated works in history, geography, and poetry. Even fashion and textile design were highly sought after in Europe and inspired new movements like the Turquerie movement in France. Far from being backward, the Ottomans were trendsetters in their own right. And lucky last, myth number 10. The Ottomans were a very religious bunch. Despite being an Islamic empire, the Ottomans were not zealous in enforcing Islamic orthodoxy, and they were religiously flexible. Ottoman power was sourced from many people of different cultural backgrounds and religions. This didn't only include people of the book, so of Abrahamic faiths like Christianity and Judaism, but also of other minorities. While Sunni Islam was the state religion, many Ottoman laws, the qanuns, the secular laws, which for instance allowed alcohol at certain points, show that they weren't really strict in enforcing religion. Also, secular law often trumped religious law. For instance, according to Sharia Islamic law, people who commit adultery are supposed to be executed. However, in the Ottoman archives, we see that there are many people accused of adultery punished, but they are very rarely executed. They used religion when it was necessary, but it didn't dictate every single aspect of life for men and women or the ruling class in the empire. I'd love to hear some of your misconceptions or things that you're curious about in regards to the Ottomans. As always, if you liked the video, don't forget to comment, give it a thumbs up. I'll see you next time.